one more time. I'm just feeling celebration tonight. Celebrate, don't wait too late. No, we don't stop. You can't stop. We're gonna celebrate one more time. One more time. One more time. A celebration. You know we're gonna do it right tonight. Hey, just feel it. Music's got me feeling the need. Yeah. Come on. All right. We're gonna celebrate one more time. Celebrate and dance so free. Music's got me feeling so free. Celebrate and dance so free. One more time. Music's got me feeling so free. We're gonna celebrate. Celebrate and dance so free. One more time. Music's got me feeling so free. We're gonna celebrate. Celebrate and dance so free. One more time. Music's got me feeling so free. We're gonna celebrate. Celebrate and dance so free. One more time. Music's got me feeling so free. We're gonna celebrate.
Or something else. I guess there could be other times a day as well. Welcome to the 4th episode of Keller Seismic series. My name is Brad Keeler. I'm the director of the Geo-Institute, and we are, of course, ecstatic to be partnering with Keller to bring you this series of outstanding talks on seismology from the geotechnical perspective, of course. If you don't know anything about the Geo-Institute, after you watch this exciting event today, you should head over to geo-institute.org, and there you will find out so many things. You can find out all about all our different programs, our strategic plan, which we just came out with a new one. You'll also find out that we're a technical society with about 12,000 members, most of whom are geotechnical engineers and/or geologists, and that we are part of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Of course, you all know this ask. If you like what you see today, and I think you will, you should click like, subscribe, and get notifications, and you will lovingly receive a message every time we post something to the YouTube channel, which is quite frequently. The only other thing before we begin, well, I must thank Keller for sponsoring this series, of course. I would be remiss not to do that. I must also show you the Carl Terzaghi bobblehead, which quantities are dwindling by the day, people. We will not be reordering these. If you would like your very own Carl Terzaghi bobblehead, you can go to geoinstitute.org, donate $96 or more to Geo-Institute student programs, and we will send you this beautiful bobblehead in the mail. You can also choose a pair of GI socks with the shield and the strata on them. Those are really cool too. But you don't want to miss out on the bobbleheads, and support GI student programs. That's super important. Now, our MC for the day, as always in the Keller Seismic series, coming to us from the left coast of America, where his mustache is growing in, looking as fantastic as it did the last time it was alive and in person. Tim Avery. And Tim's going to introduce our speaker for today. Take it away, Tim.
Well, thanks, Brad. I don't think I'll have the same exuberance you do in introducing my good friend Jeff Bachhuber, but I'll do my best. Today we have Jeff Bachhuber with us. Jeff is the Director of Geosciences at the Pacific Gas and Electric Company based in San Francisco. There, he manages an expert geoscience team focused on directing and expanding application of geoscience research and technology developments for company risk reduction. Prior to that, he was a Senior Vice President at Fugro Americas. Before that, he was also a Senior Vice President at William Lettis. And before that, he was a consulting engineering geologist at Pacific Gas and Electric, where we both worked together back in the last century. Jeff today is going to talk to us about Pacific Gas and Electric's Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant that's built on the coast of California, and he's going to discuss research and seismology studies they've done on that for the last many years and talk to us about the stability of it moving forward. With that, I give you Jeff Bachhuber.
All right. Thank you, Tim and Brad. Howdy, howdy, everybody. I have a lot of friends out there I saw in the audience, so hello to you all. Tim, special thanks for bringing me in on this. I feel like I'm on a podcast. This is very high energy here, kind of a kickoff. And I'm privileged to have a presentation. I will take you on a tour through the history of seismic studies supported by a variety of geosciences efforts for the Diablo Canyon power plant. I'm going to now launch my presentation. And just a quick confirmation, we're looking good here.
It is looking amazing, Jeff.
All right. It's a beautiful site. All right. Well, this is a pretty long, complex history. And I will try to break it down and bring us to where we are currently, which has some renewed interest in PG&E's Diablo Canyon power plant. It all started in the late 1950s, just before I was born, by the way, where after World War II, California experienced a major population growth. PG&E was challenged to keep up with baseload power generation. One solution that was very attractive to the company was to adopt the emerging nuclear energy technology. And this was promoted nationally by the Atoms for Peace initiative. PG&E initially collaborated with the 1957 Vallecito test reactor near Pleasanton, California. And this early collaboration positioned the company well to become an early adopter for the use of nuclear power for large base load power generation. In the 1960s, mid-60s to early 1970s, PG&E started looking at a variety of sites to build nuclear power plants. This map shows a number of coastal sites considered by PG&E. In addition to these, PG&E also was looking at some inland sites along the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, but really liked and preferred the coastal sites because of the ability to use seawater for once-through cooling of the reactor. And also these plants then would be closer to the load demand, population growth focused along the coast of California. The map also shows, unfortunately for this plan, numerous faults also follow the coastline of California. San Andreas Fault at this time, so again, the early 1960s, was well known. And so some of these plants were quickly rejected on the basis of understanding the challenge to design a plant for strong ground motions, maybe even surface faulting associated with the well-known San Andreas Fault. However, there were other, at the time, unknown coastal faults that ended up to be nearby selected sites for PG&E, Diablo Canyon being one of those. Ultimately, PG&E built the Humboldt Bay plant up near Eureka, which operated from 1962 to 1980. At the time, the Cascadia Fault Zone and system of faults that come on land right near the plant weren't recognized. And that became a later issue. Ultimately, the Humboldt Bay plant was shut down in 1980. The Diablo Canyon plant actually was first considered a little bit further to the south at Nipomo. However, because of strong public opposition, they decided to move the site a bit further north. Now, interestingly, the Sierra Club supported PG&E in that decision. This ended up causing a rift in the Sierra Club. So kind of interesting little sidebar history there. By the late 1960s, growing knowledge of coastal tectonics started to identify active faults in addition to the San Andreas Fault right along the coastline. Continuous uplift of the California coast, along with respective changes in sea level, rise and drop in the Pleistocene and early Holocene, formed a series of marine terraces, so stair-stepping bevels along the California coast. Quickly, geologists working on these plant siting studies recognized that these marine terraces provided an excellent geologic context, a way to assess the presence of active faults. So what they would do is take a look at these terrace deposits for evidence of displacement or deformation of the bedrock cut platforms that were initially formed horizontally. So if they had a step in them, if there was some tilting of the platform, that was a potential indication of a fault that was active since those terraces were formed. So we're looking in the hundreds of thousands of years kind of time frame there. So a really powerful tool. And to this day, for marine studies, sites along coastlines, this is a really powerful tool that we can use. It was embraced by geologic consultants supporting PG&E. So in a way, PG&E Diablo Canyon project helped advance that science, the utilization of marine terrace seismic geology principles for evaluating seismic risk for large civil facilities. This picture on the left shows excavations of the Diablo Canyon power plant. So initial site fault investigations started in 1967, and they included a grid of deep bulldozer trenches that were excavated through the superficial cover down to the bedrock wave cut platforms. This allowed geologists, notably Dr. Dick Johns from Stanford, Doug Hamilton from Earth Science Associates, to observe for any evidence of displacement or deformation of that bedrock. The trench excavations demonstrated that the bedrock platforms were not displaced or deformed by recent fault activity. At the plant site area, the platforms are correlated with the marine isotope stage 5E, 5C cut bedrock. So those are 100,000 to 120,000 years old. So this study provided evidence against fault activity for 100 to 120,000 years at least at the Diablo Canyon site. All right, so PG&E had to come up with seismic design criteria for the planned plant to support the construction permit. So at the time, deterministic fault studies were really the state of the art. They looked at the site, which is shown by the bullet here in the center of the image, and identified the closest known active fault. So San Andreas Fault at almost 50 miles from the site was characterized with a potential magnitude 8.5 earthquake. Some closer in faults included the Nacimiento Fault Zone, about 20 miles away, and also the San Ynez Fault Zone, about 50 miles to the south. The maximum earthquake for each of these sources was estimated, and then a wild card was thrown in. This was a hypothetical local fault at the site, and this was added for conservatism. And we'll see later that this was actually a really good idea at the time. They assigned a magnitude of 6.5 for that potential hypothetical local source, and then they performed the deterministic analysis. At that time, they had not identified the Hosgri fault zone, which was offshore, or other potentially active local faults closer into the plant site. Now, this was not unusual because at that time, again, we're looking at late 1960s, 1970 timeframe, civil projects typically did not integrate detailed offshore surveys. However, the oil and gas industry did, and were actively prospecting, looking for potential exploration zones, production fields offshore California, concurrent with the Diablo Canyon studies. Through the deterministic analysis, PG&E ended up calculating what they called the design earthquake, which is 0.2 G, and then doubled that, represented as the double design earthquake of 0.4 G. And so this was also adopted as the safe shutdown earthquake, the earthquake level of shaking that had to be sustained by the plant design. PG&E started constructing the foundations for the plant, doing the final design, when the Shell Oil Company identified an offshore fault close to the Diablo Canyon plant site and published this in 1971. So lead geologists advancing that work were Hoskins and Griffiths. And we'll see how that came into play for the naming of this fault in a second. So this fault was located about 3 to 4 miles offshore the Diablo Canyon plant site and represented a potential new and important earthquake source. 1971 to 1973 timeframe, PG&E reached out to the U.S. Geological Survey and sponsored additional offshore surveys to confirm the presence of this fault and perform an initial characterization so it could be considered for seismic design. In 1973, PG&E filed their operating license application. So remember, before it was a construction permit, now they're ready for the operating license. And they included information about this offshore fault and the information that they had collected to that time. In 1974, H.C. Wagner from the USGS interpreted that this fault exhibited recent activity and presented the name Hosgri Fault for this feature. Now, the name Hosgri is a combination of those two geologists at Shell, Hoskins and Griffiths. So kind of interesting. All right, so now PG&E had to recalculate their design basis because they now had a close-in active fault about 3 miles from the plant site. An initial characterization suggested a magnitude up to 7.5 for this potential earthquake source. The table here shows now, once that was added in, it significantly increased the ground motions required for design of the plant, up to 0.75 G. And so you can see the design earthquake, which was correlated to the operational basis earthquake in NRC parlance, remained at 0.2 G, but now the safe shutdown earthquake was increased to 0.75 G. Now, something to note for nuclear plants, the safe shutdown earthquake requires that all structures, systems, and components important to control safety of the plant, control the nuclear reaction, have to be functioning under that degree of loading. So this is pretty high seismic loading, especially for that time, 0.75 G. All these components had to be functioning. PG&E had to perform update of the plant based on those results. So by this time, the plant was significantly built. SSE was increased, so all the safety structure systems and components had to be reevaluated. Can they sustain a 0.7 G magnitude of shaking? There was substantial interaction reviews with the NRC, looking at this higher seismic demand. Ultimately, modifications were required for different parts of the plant. So for example, the turbine building, diaphragms had to be installed to stiffen the floor response. Electrical raceway supports, piping had to be reinforced. Some shear walls were added, and even exterior buttresses. Fire water, refueling water storage tank foundations that were used for cooling of the plant, emergency cooling, operational cooling, also had to be strengthened. The foundations actually had to be increased. So pretty major work there. That's an example of a system that had to be retrofit. So all this work resulted in a substantial delay for the plant operation. Upon review of this new work, of the new SSC and the retrofit work that was done, the Advisory Committee on Reactive Safeguards recommended to the NRC that PG&E continue to study and evaluate new seismic information, to reevaluate if the SSC that was established is still adequate. And so PG&E developed what was called the long-term seismic program to satisfy this condition that was attached to the operating license. And key elements of the program included maintaining a staff of geosciences and engineering experts to stay abreast of any new information, geological, geophysical, seismological, either developed by consultants, agencies such as the U.S. Geological Survey, or other interests such as oil and gas, continued exploration. Also, an element of that long-term seismic program was to operate a strong motion accelerometer array and what ultimately became the Central Coast Seismic Network. So PG&E installed new seismic instruments because there wasn't good coverage of the plant site by existing seismic networks. The initial long-term seismic program study for reevaluation of the seismic design basis was conducted between 1984 and 1988, leading to a final report in July of 1988. This work, so in preparation of the final report, a comprehensive series of investigations were performed. And the bullets on the left list some of the elements of that. Importantly, offshore seismic reflection surveys, so another round of those. Reviewing also existing seismic reflection survey data, detailed geologic mapping, trenches and boreholes to characterize the subsurface conditions, review of well records, sampling. I mentioned installation of the seismograph network. The map on the right shows the locations of new and existing seismographs. And so you can see the Diablo Canyon power plant is in the center of the image, and you can see the surrounding seismographs, so fairly dense coverage after those were installed. It also includes GPS and geodetic surveys. Now in this time frame, so we're looking at mid-80s, a lot of these approaches and techniques were state-of-the-art. Okay, let's see, let me make sure. Oh, there we go. In the 1988 report, integrated maps and cross sections that combine the offshore conditions and the onshore conditions were included. And this is really important, both to understand the geologic setting, the tectonic conditions, making sure that other faults were not missed. They could understand how the rock units were deformed and explain that. And then in the end, this information was used for one of the first probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, or PSHA, performed for a US nuclear power plant. The image on the left is an example of combining offshore information, primarily in this case from seismic reflection surveys, and adding that to the onshore mapping. Of course, whenever you're dealing with different data sets, there's a potential for what we often call a map fault. So this is an artificial disconnect because of maybe differing approaches, levels of detail, etc. So considerable work had to be done to seam those together, rubber sheeting, those different data sources. The Diablo Canyon plant site shown on this figure 2. So once this updated seismic source model was performed, it confirmed the adequacy of the design basis that was already established. So this was really key. So new seismic sources were identified in the past for the construction permit. As you recall, they were more distant sources, San Andreas, Nacimiento, for example. Now the driving sources were close into the plant site, the Hosgri fault. There were a couple other faults that were identified and included as seismic sources in the PSHA. Ultimately, the updated analysis, the comparison of the new PSHA generated ground motions with the existing safe shutdown earthquake basis for the Hosgri fault was approved by the NRC. All right, continued studies were performed. So even though now there was an update, seismic design, ground motions for the operating license, PG&E continued the long-term seismic program. So beyond that initial defined study that ended in 1988, both PG&E and the NRC saw the value to continue studies. So the long-term seismic program continued to collect information, monitor earthquakes around the plant site, and increase collaborations between PG&E and various agencies and research organizations. So one example was with the U.S. Geological Survey, where a cooperative research agreement was established between PG&E and the USGS to continue to evaluate local faults, improve geologic mapping, and evaluate seismic hazard. During this project, these different studies that were performed under the CRADA, a new fault was identified that closely paralleled the coast, essentially just off the Diablo Canyon plant site. This was ultimately named the Shoreline Fault and was identified by an alignment of small earthquakes near the shoreline. Further studies then were required that confirmed the presence of a fault in the offshore, and initial characterization was used to estimate a potential magnitude of 6.5 for that new earthquake source. PSHA were reperformed, including this new source, and calculated that earthquake of 6.5 on the shoreline fault would result in ground motions of about 0.56 G. This still remained below the Hosgri fault safe shutdown earthquake level. So it confirmed that even though there was this new source, the plant did not have to have any modifications to account for it. The safety margins remained adequate. This is a good example of the value of a long-term seismic program and also collaborative efforts, continuing to drive research. When you have these really long, critical facilities, maintaining due diligence and active living programs like the LTSP are really important, and they provide value when unexpected conditions arise. Now, one thing to note is a shoreline fault, a magnitude 6.5, essentially at the plant site, is the same as that hypothetical fault at the site of a magnitude 6.5 used in that original deterministic analysis. It's kind of interesting there. All right, so now the plant is reconfirmed to be fine based on this new information. Long-term seismic program keeps going on, keeps collecting new information. In the meantime, the state of California started to become concerned about reliability of their electric base load power plants. So they requested that a comprehensive reevaluation be performed for those important baseload plants, including Diablo Canyon. And this was performed from 2010 to 2015. and it was sponsored under a California Assembly Bill 1632, or AB 1632. This study included another round of extensive onshore and offshore geophysical surveys and reassessment of the defined and checking for any currently unknown, at that time, additional faults. This information was used to again update PSHA analysis, check the safety margins of the plant. On the right, I'm showing a tornado diagram, tornado plot. So this is a technique to assess the impact of uncertainties for different inputs in your seismic source model for the PSHA. And the line in the middle, denoted with orange at 1, is in general the mean. And then uncertainties for each of the elements of input to the source model are shown with the distributions. So for example, the Hosgri slip rate at the top of the chart is very wide. So it's showing that uncertainty in the slip rate, the degree of activity, the Hosgri fault, had a strong influence on the ground motions. And by reducing that uncertainty, it would be very helpful to better refine the ground motions. So this is a tool, it will come up again in a minute. So initially, there was a wide range of uncertainty. With this additional round of studies under Assembly Bill 1632, we were able to significantly narrow the uncertainty range, which are shown by the red dots and the flag 2014. So it shows the usefulness of this continued study. When you have a high level of uncertainty, you pay the penalty for having a high degree of conservatism to treat that uncertainty. All right, another element of that AB 1632 study was specifically to perform detailed onshore and offshore seismic reflection surveys. And this was called the California Central Coast Seismic Imaging Project, or CCC-SIP, acronyms, nuclear industry prevailing. Anyways, so this had ended up with a very dense onshore and offshore survey grids, and the extent of surveys and advanced techniques that were used really resulted in the most comprehensive series of data acquisition performed for a U.S. nuclear project. Again, state of the art, pushing the bar. As the AB 1632 studies were progressing, in 2011, the Tohoku, I misspelled that, sorry, magnitude 9 earthquake occurred and tsunami that impacted the Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan. In 2012, the NRC issued a request to all U.S. plant licensees to perform updated seismic and tsunami hazard evaluations that incorporated lessons learned from the damages to the Fukushima Daiichi plant. So PG&E embarked on a comprehensive seismic hazard update, and they implemented a SHAC Level 3, or Senior Seismic Hazard Analysis Committee, Level 3 approach. So this is a very comprehensive approach that is established by the NRC. It involves extensive information review, different levels of participatory and external reviews, comprehensive database collection, documentation, and a transparent process are really important for a SHAC Level 3 study. It represented state of the art, again, and was greatly benefited by the ongoing AB 1632 detailed seismic reflection studies and mapping, and also the past shoreline fault study and other previous studies that were performed for the site. So a rich amount of data that was highly useful for the SHAC process. The SHAC Level 3 process is focused to capture the center, body, and range of technically defensible interpretations of input for the seismic PSHA models. All right, a final report was completed in 2015. It included both a seismic source characterization report and also a ground motion characterization report. On the top is an example of a logic tree. So there's a complex series of models and input considering different alternatives. The SHAC study included numerous workshops that were open to the public for observation, and as I mentioned, a transparent and well-documented process. The updated PSHA results from that SHAC study provided input also to now analyze the plant, so perform a seismic probabilistic risk assessment of the response of the actual structures, components, and systems of the power plant. All right, so this slide is comparing now the different vintages of seismic design, seismic ground motion levels for the Diablo Canyon plant. So on the left, we had already reviewed through the 1970s studies that integrated for the first time the newly discovered Hosgri fault, established as a safe shutdown earthquake, so 0.75 G. In the middle are results from 1980s to 2000s vintage probabilistic seismic hazard analysis. The spectrum that envelopes all these, so the black dashed line, was the spectrum from that initial Hosgri earthquake, safe shutdown earthquake. You'll notice there's a strange bump at the top of that line. This is because at the time, two key consultants, Bloom and Newmark, had different interpretations of the design spectra. So those were combined. So it makes kind of an unusual shape there. On the right, we're showing the 2015 SHAC level 3 ground motion response spectra. And it generally fit within the envelope of that original SSC spectra. There were some exceedances, but these occurred outside of the plant frequency range of importance. So safety margins were still maintained for the plant site. So after all this detailed work, it kept confirming that the safe shutdown earthquake, the original design basis, was adequate. All right, so that brings us to today. So in 2017, PG&E made the decision to withdraw their application to extend the plant operating license. So for US NRC plants, you can't extend them for a 20-year period. PG&E had started the application process, but in 2017 decided not to go forward with that. Now, there were a number of reasons involved in that decision. A lot of them were external events that forced PG&E in some ways to consider shutdown of the plant. Some of those included obtaining permission for continued once-through cooling. Also, economics of nuclear power versus other power sources, and then the oncoming, and at that time, really building alternative energy. Nuclear power was not considered a green energy source, and the state of California was driving to transition to clean green energy. So even though it's a zero carbon electrical power source, it wasn't considered as green, as desirable as these other alternates such as solar power or wind. Now, there is some non-factual information that is perpetrated constantly, and that is that PG&E decided to shut down the plant because it was not seismically stable. And as I demonstrated through all of these years, multiple levels of studies and reviews, there was no concern for PG&E regarding the seismic reliability and stability of the plant. Instead, it were these other types of conditions that led to that decision. Well, the idea to swap out green energy, alternative energy for nuclear power didn't really pan out as initially expected. It's taking longer for solar turbine wind turbines and other types of energies to really replace baseload electric power, stability of the grid, night and daytime power generation, all those advantages of a nuclear plant. And so people started thinking in different groups, reevaluating, maybe we've been shortcutting nuclear power because it's a really potential important way to transition to green energy. In 2022, State of California requested PG&E to extend the Diablo Canyon plant operations for another 5 years beyond the 2025 shutdown. So in order to help affect this, the state earmarked a $1.4 billion loan to PG&E to allow for picking up the license again and reapplying for a life extension of the plant. Now, this loan does have a covenant attached to it to perform a seismic update. So again, there's a driver for PG&E to look at updating, reviewing past work, and updating, if warranted, the seismic design. All right, so at this point, PG&E is actively performing seismic update. And so we're starting off by reviewing the past studies, and we are using a graded approach. And so the initial phase is comparing information. Is there anything new? So the 2015 Shack Level 3 work wasn't that long ago, and it was a very comprehensive study. The long-term seismic program continued to keep abreast of any new research and actually drive and fund that research. So that put PG&E in a good position to understand any new information. So the first task is to look at that and determine, has any of the hazard input changed enough that it could be potentially be changing hazard calculations? If we do find that there is some significant new information or changes to that input, then under this graded approach, we can move to recalculating hazard and then comparing that to the existing design basis. So that's a plan. This will be performed through this year into next year. And it includes a number of items that we specifically will be checking. So this includes slip rate and geometry of the local faults. And so the map on the right shows really the controlling fault sources, the Hosgri fault that we've been discussing, the shoreline fault, and then also the San Luis Bay fault and the Los Osos fault to the south and north of the plant site, respectively. So those will be checked. Is there anything new, anything suggesting that we should be reevaluating the slip rates, for example, of those faults? Looking at regional deformation models, comparing any new earthquake knowledge. So remember that the shoreline fault was initially identified by alignment of small earthquake epicenters. Checking, is there anything else that we could pull out of the seismic recordings that we've been monitoring? Something that's become, I'll say, in vogue or acknowledged by seismic industry is the potential for linked faults. So in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, a lot of effort was put on determining segmentation of large active fault systems. How far could a fault rupture along those individual fault systems that may have bends or small steps in them? Now we're looking at linking, jumping from one fault to the next in a propagating earthquake, fault rupture. And there have been a number of recent earthquake events that are suggesting this may not be that unusual to happen. In New Zealand, recent faulting there, earthquakes, various faults in California, Southern California, also have been showing that potential behavior. Another element is faults that currently are not well mapped. So for PG&E, the most significant recent earthquakes have been the Ridgecrest earthquake, the Napa earthquake, not on active identified through-going faults at the time. And so this is an area that we'll be checking. Is there anything that we need to be looking at regarding linked fault, increasing magnitudes that we'd have to then factor in a seismic design. All right, as I mentioned, the long-term seismic program research keeps continuing. Here's some examples of current work that we're doing. And so this will feed into our seismic update, and then we'll just be continuing through operation at Diablo Canyon. So PG&E has made the commitment that as long as the plant operates, we'll continue to run the long-term seismic program. One important element of the long-term seismic program is learning from earthquakes. Large earthquakes are rare, and so you need to accumulate information from various earthquakes globally. So we do that, and here's some examples on this table of earthquakes that we've studied, provided reconnaissance support, participated in, and then determining lessons learned and how we could apply that to our models and risk assessments. All right, my last slide, I have some recommended reading. If you're interested in this topic and want to know more, the book, The Atom of the Fault by Richard Meehan's excellent. It really goes through the history of nuclear plant projects along the coast of California and how fault investigations, seismic geology played into that. So some of that history is repeated in my talk here. Also, practical implementation guidelines for the SHAC level 3 and 4 hazard studies give you more depth of what that is, how comprehensive those studies are. PG&E maintains some websites also where you could collect information. So I mentioned transparency. PG&E has a process where we make our information publicly available and available for other researchers. These links will need to be sent separately. I have them on here, but for you to be able to use those, I'll check with Brad to see a good way to do that if you're interested. Or you could always contact me at jeffbachhuber@pgne.com. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your patience, and I hope you found that interesting. Tim, I'm going to turn it back to you for questions and answers and see what kind of time we have remaining.
Well, Jeff, thank you very, very much for that very interesting presentation. Certainly, I learned a lot of stuff that I've been hearing throughout the past 30, 35 years on Diablo Canyon. A couple housekeeping things. So we will have questions. If you folks do need PDH credits for this, please email me in response to please send me a PDH. If you live in Florida, New York, Indiana, New Jersey, North Carolina, or Maryland, please indicate that you live in one of those states. You require a special PDH. With that, we'll open up to questions, and I've got a question. Your long-term research seismic program, that's really interesting. What do you see as emerging research focus areas for that LTSP?
I mentioned linked faults, so that's really important. We need to understand that better. And we are supporting research, again, taking advantage when a large earthquake does occur that shows that kind of behavior. So we can better understand that. We need to get some level of confidence, but are using that in alternative models. And so that's an area. Another is alternate methods to evaluate ground motions. So we've been exploring the use of precariously balanced rocks. So these are rocks, let's say on a slope, that would be triggered to fail under a certain level of ground shaking. You can date that surface that they're sitting on. You can calculate using slope stability analysis, toppling block analysis to see what level of ground motion could trigger that to fall out of the slope. So its presence establishes an estimate of non-exceedance at a certain PGA level. So we're really interested in that because that would be a way to independently check the PSHA calculations.
Excellent. Well, we're getting some questions here. We have one from Gown Reese, Alexandria. What is the plan for spent fuel storage when the plant eventually closes?
So PG&E developed an independent spent fuel storage facility, ISFAC installation, in the early 2000s, and they have been storing in dry cask containers at the plant site spent fuel. The size of that installation plus the capacity in the spent fuel pool attached to the plant is sufficient for the expected lifetime extension. So a combination of the existing ISFC dry cask and the spent fuel pool.
Very interesting. Thank you. Rick Henderson asks, has PZ seismic surveying been completed to better understand the geometry of the shoreline fault?
I'm sorry, again, what type of technique was that, Tim?
PZ seismic surveying. Maybe this is a game of telephone.
It could be. It's not triggering what that may be.
So apparently it hasn't.
Okay, we have.
I'm fit to say that.
Techniques. So some of those I mentioned are seismic reflection profiles. We use seismic refraction in some cases, aeromagnetics, gravity. So a wide variety of geophysical survey techniques have been used. Now, a couple of things that are challenging is the shoreline fault. It's essentially at the surf zone. And so you have your deep water, offshore type of survey method, so you could only come in so close to the coast. And then you have your onshore that in essentially at the water line. And so that's a really tough location to be able to characterize. And quite a bit of effort was used to try to sew together the offshore onshore survey results. But that is a challenging environment.
Okay, interesting. Let's see, are we getting another? Okay, Rick Henry, transitional zone seismic, TZ, transitional zone seismic across the shoreline from land to marine environments.
Yeah, and so it's a combination of the techniques and having methodology to sew those together. There is some equipment, and this was actually used during one of the studies, where you have a inflatable boat, and so you could actually get into the surf zone, and they have light geophysical instrumentation, so you could do some seismic and other types of geophysical imaging right directly in that zone, and then use that to help correlate to the other deep water and onshore work. So I hope that answered your question.
Okay. Let's see, we're a bit sluggish on that. I'll ask another question. So you guys have done obviously an awful lot of work on the Diablo Canyon seismic studies. Is this consistent across PG&E and your other facilities and lines of business?
Diablo Canyon is a special beast. It has had so much study, very sophisticated methodologies, but we are using approaches that we've developed for Diablo Canyon, the knowledge base and expertise, to now start to look at our other facilities. So for example, we are starting to implement seismic risk models that are informed by the same types of techniques of data collection for our electric and gas system that were developed at Diablo Canyon. So we're actively branching out, and where it is warranted, we are applying that type of approach. Sometimes you don't need to go in that level of detailed study, but we are trying to standardize the way we do seismic analysis across PG&E, all of our infrastructure.
Excellent. Seems a bit slow. Let me ask another question, if I may then. One of the big issues with the Fukushima Daiichi plant was the tsunami that perhaps created the most damage. What is the stability, or how does Diablo Canyon compare to the Fukushima plant should a tsunami occur?
That's a great question. I actually have a backup slide. If I could get back into my presentation and show you that, because that will help illustrate it well. All right. Damn it. Okay, this figure here is a comparison exactly of that.
You had it. You had it. You're go back to your last one. You did have it on the screen. This is just you, which isn't bad. You and your motorcycle, your Ducati.
And I apologize. Okay, share. Here we go. Did it come up this time?
Perfect.
Okay, so this is a comparison of Diablo Canyon and Fukushima. So Diablo Canyon, the elevation of the plant's at 85 feet. So that's that terrace that it's built upon. The Fukushima plant was a lot lower. You could see that the grade of the plant was more around, what is that, about 20 feet. It turns out that the Fukushima plant grade was actually substantially higher, but they intentionally lowered the grade to reduce the demand on pumps for the cooling water. And so they reduced the freeboard that they had previously. So calculations for the ultimate tsunami height at Fukushima, you can see in the center of the table, 33 to 46 feet. That their design is for a 21-foot wave, and so it exceeds there. Diablo Canyon performed a number of updated tsunami studies. So after the Sumatra earthquake, we evaluated potential distant source generated tsunamis. Also local submarine landslides. What would that look like? What kind of tsunami could it generate? And then as part of the Fukushima response, in addition to ground motions, we also performed an updated tsunami analysis. And we used probabilistic tsunami hazard analysis for that work. At Diablo Canyon, it results in a calculated run-up height of about 35 feet. And that combines a tsunami plus high storm waves plus a high tide. So that only extends about halfway up the sea cliff. So we still have a huge amount of freeboard below the plant. So it's not comparable. Diablo Canyon doesn't have the same type of potential hazard exposure as Fukushima.
Well, thank you. Are there any other questions? You've given such a great, thorough presentation that we've left people completely illuminated and educated on the seismic issues there.
Or they're asleep. Wake up.
We don't have any more coming in the chat box, but
okay.
That's okay. Tim, you kept it alive.
Well,
you had some good ones.
Well, Jeff, could you give us a little tune or something while we're? No, thank you, Jeff. That was phenomenal. It's interesting to see the work that you guys have been doing, that you've taken over from Lloyd Clough. When he was there, he was sort of our boss 30 some years ago of the entire geosciences group, and now we're speaking with him. That's very cool. That's neat to see the loop close.
I owe a lot to Lloyd too. He stood up geoscience. He had the vision that this is a really important thing for the company to focus on, and it really paid off big time. And it was Lloyd, his vision, really awesome guy. So I'm rattling in his shoes, trying to fill in there.
You're doing a great job.
We actually did just get something that came in. I'm curious why the Humboldt power plant was shut down in 1980. Was it mainly due to unaccounted seismic hazard or something else?
It was exactly that. So that was a case where, again, like Diablo, during initial plant construction, local active faults weren't considered. Turns out that there were active faults very close into that site, not under the plant, but close enough that it was becoming a really significant issue. And it looked like the design level ground motions would have to be increased significantly. The plant was already in a shutdown for refueling as these studies were going on. So a decision was made, it's just not worth it to retrofit the plant. We're going to terminate and shut down. So it was driven by seismic hazard in that case.
Great answer. And I'm constantly struck when I think about these things, how humanity lived for tens of thousands of years just dealing with earthquakes. And I mean, maybe we didn't have a way to account for seismic hazard, but it's still fascinating to me that we just essentially rolled with it as a civilization. Anyway, that's a whole different tangent. We could do an hour on that. Jeff, thanks. This was amazing. Tim, great moderating skills as usual. This was fantastic. Episode 4, I don't know if you want to give a preview of episode 5, Tim, if you've got it right there.
Well, I don't, but I believe that's Dr. Peter Robertson, is going to talk about the use of CPTs for determining liquefaction susceptibility, etc. He's the CPT analysis guru, so we're looking forward to that.
And that'll be on July. July 15th, on this very YouTube channel where you are watching this. Always good to have a cone head, as it were, on the YouTube channel. I'm sure Paul Main will be very excited that we worked that into the presentation today. Well, thanks again, Jeff, and thanks, Tim, and thanks to Keller for putting all this together. It's been a great success from my viewpoint. We're really enjoying this partnership, and it's been a lot of fun, and we're looking forward to the last couple of these as we go throughout the summer. So again, for all our viewers, thanks for sticking around till the end. Usually that means that you liked what you saw. And if that is the case, of course, click those buttons again, like, subscribe, get notifications. We'll let you know every time we post something. We will be taking a little break from our live streams now. This is our last one until July 15th, when we're back with episode 5 of the Keller Seismic series. So until then, we wish everybody a great summer. Make sure you do something fun. Be sure to put all your photos up, tag them Summer of Soil wherever you are, and we will make sure that those go out on the GI social media feeds too. You must have soil involved in your summer plans. Otherwise, what are you doing, really? So thanks again, everybody. Our producer today was Sean Herpelsheimer. Thanks to him for putting all this together, and we will see you very shortly.
Adios. Thank you.
Smeared black ink. Your palms are sweaty.